Hello, Mario here. This is a video to show different ways to add lights to a scene in After Effects. This is a scene that we'll be working with. The character and layout and animation actually are all by Sophia Santos. Great little piece. I'm going to cover 4 different lighting options. Sun rays or light rays, which you can see here in the scene. Highlights, which you can see on the character. Rim lights, which are usually on the outline of the character, and drop shadows. Before we get into actually creating lights and effects, I want to review how masks work in After Effects. Masks are really powerful, especially in After Effects. So what I'm going to do is give a brief introduction to how masks work. I'm also going to introduce you to a new layer in After Effects. So I have a comp here that I've already created, 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second. And I'm going to add a new layer. Layer, new, and this is going to be a shape layer. And this shape layer is very handy. Basically, it allows us to draw shapes in our scene. So I add this shape layer, I grab the pen tool, and I make sure I'm drawing a shape, not a mask. I set my fill. I'm going to click on the word fill and make sure it's solid. Okay, because there's gradients here as well. And I don't need an outline. So that's what this stroke option is. I'm going to turn my outline to 0. And now, just for the demonstration of masks, I'm just going to draw a simple shape. And it fills it in according to what we selected up here. Okay, and it's funny that this seems so simple, and why would a shape layer ever matter? Why would you ever want to use a shape layer? But we use it quite often. But today I'm just going to use it to demonstrate how these masks work. So I have this shape layer, and that's the only layer. I'm going to duplicate this layer. So edit, duplicate. Okay. So now these layers are identical. And I'm going to hit this toggle switch down here at the bottom. What that switch gives me access to is this track mat. I could change how this layer is shown based on the mask or the drawing above. So I'm going to rename this. So even though these layers are identical, I want you to realize that that's going to be our mask. So going back to this track mat, I'm going to select alpha, and you can see that it's going to select the shape mask. Shape mask. Okay, so it's actually using that layer as our mask. And I select it, and nothing happens. I'm going to select it again, but this time I'm going to use the alpha inverted mat for the same layer. And now what we have is nothing. Okay, this layer is on, but this shape above here is hiding this shape. These shapes are identical. This mask layer is actually hiding this shape layer. Now you will notice that the mask automatically hides itself, and that's fine. But this layer is showing. and is hidden. Now let me show you how this mask works. I'm going to select this mask layer and I'm going to move it around. Okay, so you can see how it's hiding it. I could pull it right off and it'll show the whole thing. It's only hiding parts of it. And if I put this back to alpha, the reverse happens. See that? So that's how this mask works. And you'll think, when will I ever use this? But we actually use this all the time. And I'll be using a number of these today. Okay, let's bring in our layout. And our character. Remember, we have to import animation. And similar to my last video, I'm going to create a world for this character to live in. So there's the sky. I'm going to create a composition from that sky. Rename it, and I'll call it Comp World. And I'll pull in the foreground option, curb, and I believe. Okay, so there's our layout. Bring the animation in. I'm also going to bring in a street light. Now I must apologize. This is my street light, not Sophia's. So I am kind of adding something that really doesn't look as good. I think the background and the character look great, and then we go and add my crappy street light. I apologize. But it'll give us a place to add our light rays. Character's there. I'm just going to resize it. And bring it down. Okay, so we have everything laid out. Probably be a good time to save this. Okay, so let's add some light rays. So earlier we added a shape layer, and that's actually what I'm going to use to create these simple light rays. So layer, new, shape layer. Again, we're going to grab the pen. We're going to make sure it's selected to create a shape, not a mask. We're going to change the fill to a gradient. And I'm going to change the color. So this is the color of our light. And it's actually the same on both sides. But the reason why I select the gradient is so that I have opacity options up top here. So I'm going to put another one, a third one here. This one will be 100. This one will be 0. And this one will be 0. So I'm using the gradient to blend out this light. And I just clicked to give me that third option there. So again, these bottom ones are color, top ones are your opacity. Again, make sure the stroke is set to 0 because you don't want your lights to have outside lines. And then what I'm going to do is draw a shape where I want the light. Okay, and that looks fine. The funny thing is we're not seeing any color. Now I know I selected color, but I'm not seeing it. And this is one of the weird things about the shape tool. Let me go back to my select tool and open up this shape layer. Inside the shape layer, there's contents, and this is where you can draw different shapes. Right now, I only drew one shape. In that shape, I can click on the gradient. And here's my gradient control over here. See that? You only see it when you're selecting, when you click on the shape or on the gradient itself. And then you could pull these into place and this will be your control for your gradients. So that's what's going to give us our highlights. Now, it's pretty ugly right now, but there's some things that we can do to it to make it look a little bit better. So for one thing, it's hiding our character, so I'm going to pull our character in front. It will look unnatural, but that's okay. We're going to control the character's lighting separately. So I'm back on this shape layer. I'm going to back off the opacity just a bit. Now there's a lot of ways to control opacity in all these layers. I always control my opacity through the transform option. Once in a while I do it another way, but as much as I can, I do my opacity settings under transform. So that in itself will make it look a little bit better. Still, it's got this very harsh line. I like how it's fading out, but it's still got this very harsh line. So what I do to soften that is I go under the effects control and I add an effect. Effect, blur, and I add a Gaussian blur. And you just crank right on that thing. And you'll see that the lighting becomes a little more usable. It's a very simple lighting approach. We basically added a shape layer, used the pen, made sure it was drawing a shape, changed our fill to gradient. We clicked on the color. So you click on the word fill to change the gradient. You click on the color to change the colors and the opacity. Then I drew it with the pen tool. Now if you want to see that effect, there's my blur under effects. And you could turn that off and on to see what it looks like. And I could change it in here as well. There's the option there. So the lighting is very straightforward. It's just a shape layer. So now let's add the highlight to the character. This is the animation that we brought in, and I'm going to rename it to original. And I'm going to make 2 more copies of that. So edit, duplicate, edit, duplicate. So now I have 3 copies of the exact same animation. The top one will be our mask. The middle one will be our lighting. And the third one we're going to leave the same. Okay, so we have our original. Let's work on our lighting. Now the thinking behind this lighting option, right now we're only looking at the lighting layer. imagine this character completely lit. Imagine this character completely lit. So a light evenly placed across this entire character. What would that look like? Well, what I'm going to do is add an effect. Color control. I could just simply use brightness and contrast. That'll work. And I'm going to turn up the brightness. We can consider this to be our lighted character. That's the original lighting. See the difference? One layer is just simply lighter than the other. Just like the mask demonstration that I used, I'm going to use the inverted mask of our mask layer. Okay, and you can see it's now hidden. You can see a bit of an outline. Let me turn that back off. Okay, so this is the lighting version. That's the original. I'm going to turn off the original and use the inverted alpha of the mask layer, the layer above it. And that hides it. That's what we want. I'm going to turn the original back on. So our lighting is showing and our original is showing. I'm going to go to the mask layer and I'm going to move it just like I did with the earlier demonstration. Okay, and that gives us our highlight. Okay, by moving that mask layer, we'll expose the bright layer underneath. So I'm looking at the light rays, the way they're coming down, and I'm kind of mimicking that. Now that's working, it's not bad, but it is harsh, and I wouldn't leave it that way. So what I do is I take this mask and I do what I did with the light rays. I add a blur. Gaussian blurs work well. Sometimes I will use a fast blur just to save on render time. And there you go. Now it softens that highlight. So let's see what that looks like with that off again. So now the character has a bit of a highlight. So the original is the original color that you're seeing. The lighting layer is just a lighter version of the original layer. The mask is what we use to expose some of the lighting layer. Okay, so let's do a rim light. Let's say the character is lit from behind. So the rim light is a similar approach. We're going to take the original animation, duplicate it, rename the new one to rim light, put it behind the character, and I'm going to hide the original. So I need to make this look like it's lit. If I want to bleach it right out, a better effect would be color correction, color balance. I use this a lot for lighting and effects. There's my lightness. I crank on that, and I can get this to go completely white. Perfect. Now if I turn on the original, it just covers that. You could see that the rim light is a little bit there. You could see a little bit of that rim light shining through. But we want a little bit more. The trick to control it is again adding another effect. I right click, adding a blur, and we can use a fast blur for that. And there's a rough rim light. Now if I turn that light ray back on, the rim light is kind of working. It's the wrong color though. So I always match my rim light to the light that's shining. So what we do on the rim light is use another correction tool, color correction tool, and use channel mixer. Channel mixer is great because it lets us control the RGB. So if I back off the blue, I'll pull it right back, it gives us a yellow rim light. See that? So I can dial this in to be closer to the shape light that we have, or the spotlight that we have. Usually we don't do this on the entire body. This works, but usually it's a headshot that we're doing or mid-shot. But you get the idea. The nice thing about doing these kinds of effects is it does it for the entire animation. The last effect that I'm going to show is the drop shadow. Now, again, there's a couple ways to do this. Sometimes you just want a stylized shadow, and I'll show you how to do that. Sometimes you're going to want a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to show two different types of drop shadows. One simple way to throw a shadow on this would be to add a new shape layer, grab the ellipse tool, make sure it's drawing a shape. In the fill, for a shadow, I'll use a radial gradient. And for the color, it's simply black. Now you'd think I would just want a circle underneath it. So I would draw the ellipse in perspective. But the trick to the ellipse tool is to draw it round and my gradient's a little strange. And then flatten this down. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just a simple shape. We do want to change the opacity to make it blend in. Put it under the character. Maybe reposition it a little bit better. Now, the only problem with this type of drop shadow is when the character moves, the shadow does not follow the character. So we actually have to key the position of this to follow. So I'd set a key here. And then have it follow. Okay, of course you'd have to adjust it. Okay, just by getting the keys further apart, we'll keep it more on track. The space between the keys are what you're going to adjust first. And you usually can get it pretty close. There you go. So this type of drop shadow, it's simple, but it works. It is a style, but you do have to key that shadow. Another way of creating a shadow, which is more accurate, is to make a copy of the original animation. Edit, duplicate. I'm going to rename it to animation shadow. Put it underneath. And we're going to turn this layer into our shadow. So I'm going to hide the original animation. This is the only animation layer that we're seeing. So I'm right-clicking on the layer, Effects, Color Correction, and I'm going to use the color balance again. But this time, instead of making it white, I'm going to use it to make it black. Then I'm going to add another effect. Right-click, Distort, Slant. And what slant gives us is it lets us change the height, and the slant of our shadow. So now when I turn the original animation back on, it doesn't line up perfectly. Now sometimes your animation will have keys. This particular one doesn't. When I was originally working with this scene, I did key certain parts of this animation. What I don't want to happen is to change the keys between these two layers. So I add what's called a null. It's very similar to a peg in Toon Boom Harmony. What I do is I add a null, effect, layer, new, null. Okay, and you can see it way over here. pull that over. And I'm going to use this to move our shadow. So I move it roughly where my shadow is. Then I attach my shadow to it. See the parent? Null. So now wherever I move this null, my shadow will move. So now I can line it up. And of course, add our blurs. I am going to shrink it a bit. And again with the null, just going to adjust it a bit. And add my blur to the shadow. Okay, and that shadow will follow that character everywhere that character goes. Now, if you notice, the light is going this way and the shadow is going that way. That makes no sense. So let's fix that. Go to our slant, height, and you can go into the negative. And again, adjust it with the null. Now, most important, the shadow should have some opacity setting on it. So under transform, I'm going to turn my opacity down. And it makes it blend into the scene a lot nicer. Hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to place some questions in the comments.